Imagine you're standing in a crowd of 72,000 people. The stadium is electric, everyone is screaming, the lights are going insane, and on stage, the Michael Jackson is mid-concert, in the middle of one of the most iconic performances of his entire career. And then, he stops. Not a pause between songs, not a technical glitch. He stops everything. The music cuts, the dancers freeze, the lights dim. And Michael Jackson, in front of 72,000 absolutely stunned fans, starts scanning the crowd. Looking for someone. One person in 72,000. The crowd goes quiet. People start looking around. Security is confused. Everyone's asking the same question. What is happening right now? And then they find her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, completely lost, crying her eyes out, separated from her parents in the chaos of the concert. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, paused his entire show, stopped tens of thousands of fans mid-concert, and held up the entire production, just to make sure one lost little girl felt safe. That's the Michael Jackson that the media rarely talked about. And today, that's exactly who we're going to talk about. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, this channel is where we go deep on stories that actually matter about the people the world thinks it already knows. Today, we're talking about Michael Jackson. And I know what you're thinking. We've heard everything about Michael Jackson already. But I promise you, you haven't heard this version of his story. Because the media gave us one version of Michael Jackson, the tabloid version, the scandal version, the trial version. But the real Michael Jackson, the one his closest friends, crew members, and even strangers talked about, was something completely different. This is that story. And look, before we dive in, if this kind of deep storytelling is your thing, do me a quick favor and subscribe. I put serious research into every single one of these videos, and it would genuinely mean a lot to have you along for the ride. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's get into it. To understand why Michael Jackson did things like stop a 72,000-person concert for one lost little girl, you need to understand where he came from. Because Michael Jackson wasn't born into luxury. He wasn't discovered at some fancy talent show in Hollywood. He didn't come from a family with connections or money or any kind of safety net. He came from Gary, Indiana. Now, Gary in the late 1950s was a tough, working-class city. The kind of place where you worked hard and still barely got by. And the Jackson family, they were the definition of barely getting by. Joseph Jackson, Michael's father, was a crane operator who played guitar on the side. He had big dreams of making it in music, but life had other plans. He and Michael's mother, Catherine, raised 10 children in a 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street, which, by the way, is a real street. The house was tiny. The family was crowded. Money was always tight. But there was music everywhere. Catherine played clarinet and piano. Joseph's guitar was always around. And the kids, well, they had talent. Natural, undeniable talent. Michael was born on August 29, 1958, the 8th of 10 children. And from the very beginning, people noticed something different about him. He was the kid who picked up a routine faster than anyone else. The kid who could hear a song once and perform it like he'd practiced for years. The kid who, even at 5 or 6 years old, could move in a way that made adults stop and stare. And his father noticed. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because Joseph Jackson's recognition of his children's talent wasn't exactly gentle. Joseph was a disciplinarian, and that's putting it kindly. When he formed the Jackson Brothers, a group that eventually included Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and little Michael, he ran rehearsals like a military operation. Practice was mandatory. Mistakes were not tolerated. By the time Michael was 6 years old, he was already performing regularly with his brothers. 6 years old, not playing Little League, not watching cartoons on Saturday morning, performing in clubs, in pubs, in front of adult audiences who threw coins and clapped and had no idea they were watching a future legend. And the rehearsals at home, they were brutal. Michael would later describe his father as someone who ruled through fear. Mess up a step, Joseph would correct it physically. Forget a lyric, there were consequences. And beyond the physical discipline, there was something else Joseph did that Michael carried with him for the rest of his life. He made fun of Michael's nose. Michael had a slightly wider nose, common in his family, nothing unusual. But Joseph used to point it out, tease him about it, mock him in front of his siblings. Michael later said that his father's words about his appearance made him deeply insecure about his face. And if you've ever wondered why Michael Jackson had all those surgeries, why he kept changing his face decade after decade, this is where it started. Not vanity, not a desire to look different, but a little boy who grew up being told by his own father that his face wasn't good enough. That kind of wound doesn't heal, it just gets buried. But despite all of that, despite the pressure, the fear, the exhaustion of performing at such a young age, the talent was undeniable. By the late 1960s, the Jackson brothers had rebranded as the Jackson 5, and they were already turning heads on the local circuit. And then, in 1969, something massive happened. Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown Records, one of the most powerful men in American music, signed the Jackson 5. Motown, the label that had launched Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, that Motown. And the Jackson 5 didn't just join the label, they exploded on it. Songs like I Want You Back, ABC, I'll Be There, The Love You Save, these weren't just hits. They were mega hits. The kind that played everywhere all the time that made people stop whatever they were doing and turn up the volume. And Michael, the youngest, the smallest, the one who'd been told his face wasn't right, was the center of it all. At 11 years old, Michael Jackson was already a star. Now there's a version of this story where everything is just triumph after triumph. Young kid, massive talent, Motown, global fame, easy narrative, right? But the reality was more complicated. Because even as the Jackson 5 was blowing up, Michael was still a child. A child who was working constantly, performing constantly, traveling constantly, and doing all of it under an enormous amount of pressure. He never had a normal childhood. He never went to a school dance. Never had a best friend he could just hang out with after school. Never got to be bored on a summer afternoon with nothing to do. Every single moment of his childhood was structured around performing. And the cost of that, the emotional cost, wouldn't fully show up until much later. But professionally, the trajectory was remarkable. After Motown, the family moved to Epic Records, and Michael began focusing more seriously on his solo career. And then, in 1979, everything changed. Off the Wall came out. And look, we talk a lot about Thriller, and we should, but Off the Wall deserves its moment. This album was a cultural earthquake. 4 top 10 singles from a single album, which had never been done by a solo artist before. It sold over 20 million copies. It showed the world that Michael Jackson wasn't just a child star who'd grown up. He was something entirely new, something that didn't have a category yet. He also became the highest-paid recording artist in terms of royalties at that point. He was 21 years old. And then came Thriller. 1982, the album that changed everything. I'm not going to sit here and give you the Wikipedia breakdown of Thriller because you've heard it. What I want to do instead is help you feel how significant this was. By the time Thriller came out, Michael Jackson was already famous. He was already successful. He didn't need this album to be good, but it wasn't just good. It was a phenomenon. The Thriller music video alone, 14 minutes long, directed like a horror film with Michael transforming into a zombie, was something no one had ever seen before. Music videos at that point were promotional clips. Simple, cheap. Thriller was a short film. It revolutionized what a music video could be. The album produced 7 top 10 singles, 7 out of 9 tracks. It won 8 Grammy Awards in a single night, still a record. It is, to this day, the best-selling album in history. We're talking somewhere between 66 and 70 million copies sold worldwide. No other album has come close. And it was during this era, the early 1980s, that Michael Jackson became something beyond famous. He became iconic. He became the kind of celebrity that transcended music, transcended race, transcended nationality. Michael Jackson was famous in places where people had never heard an American song before. He was famous in countries where English wasn't spoken. He was famous in ways that simply didn't make sense for someone who was, at the end of the day, just a musician from Indiana. And then came the moonwalk. March 25, 1983. Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever. A television special celebrating Motown's 25th anniversary. Michael and his brothers performed together for the first time in years. The crowd was ecstatic. But then, Michael stepped forward for his solo moment. Billie Jean started playing, and in the middle of that performance, he did something that made 47 million television viewers collectively lose their minds. He slid backward. Smooth, effortless, gliding, like he was on ice. Like gravity had simply decided to take a break for a few seconds. The moonwalk. Now Michael didn't invent the move. Versions of it existed in street dance and earlier performers had done similar things. But Michael perfected it. He made it his. And in that single television moment, it became the most recognizable dance move in the history of human civilization. Think about that for a second. Out of every dance move ever performed by every person who ever lived, the moonwalk is the one that everyone on Earth immediately recognizes and connects to one person. That's Michael Jackson. Okay, so now you understand the scale of what we're talking about. This is a man who was performing in front of tens of thousands of people regularly. Stadiums. Not clubs, not theaters, stadiums. The kind of shows where the floor vibrates, where the lights can be seen from miles away, where a single ticket is something people save up for months to afford. So now let's go back to that moment I told you about at the beginning. 72,000 fans, a stadium absolutely packed to capacity, Michael Jackson mid-show. And he stops. Now here's some context that makes this even more remarkable. A Michael Jackson concert wasn't just a concert. It was a production. We're talking years of planning, months of rehearsal, enormous crews, custom stage equipment, choreography that was drilled to perfection. Every second of a Michael Jackson show was mapped out. The lighting cues, the pyrotechnics, the costume changes, the transitions between songs, all of it was precision engineered. You didn't just improvise in the middle of a Michael Jackson concert. The whole machine stopped if one thing went off script. And yet, Michael Jackson stopped the machine. His security team spotted it, a little girl, separated from her family, completely overwhelmed by the crowd. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. In a stadium of 72,000 people, she was absolutely tiny, completely lost, and absolutely terrified. Michael saw her, or rather he was told about her. And his response was immediate. Stop the show, find the girl, make sure she's okay. His crew worked quickly. They identified the girl, guided her through the crowd, and within a few minutes, she was brought backstage. Now here's the part that really gets me. Michael Jackson, who had a concert to finish, who had 72,000 people waiting, who had an entire production schedule to maintain, sat with that little girl. He talked to her. He made sure she wasn't scared. He had his team find her parents and reunite her with them. And then he went back out and finished the concert. No big announcement to the crowd about what had happened. No performance of generosity for the cameras. Just a man who saw a scared child and stopped everything to make it right. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's a nice story, but it's one moment, one nice thing. But here's what's important to understand. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't Michael Jackson having a good day and deciding to do something kind. This was who he was. The people who worked with him, his crew members, his backup dancers, the people who set up his stages and drove his cars and cooked his food, they all tell versions of this same story. Michael Jackson was obsessed with children, not in the dark way the media framed it, in the way of someone who understood children deeply, who felt safer around them than around adults, who believed that children saw the world the way it was supposed to be seen, without judgment, without politics, without agenda. He once said in an interview that when he was with children, he felt peace. He felt understood, because children didn't see Michael Jackson the superstar, they just saw a person who wanted to play. And when you understand his childhood, the pressure, the lack of innocence, the years of performing while other kids were just being kids, it starts to make sense. Michael Jackson spent his entire childhood being an adult. He spent the rest of his life trying to reclaim what he'd lost. Now I want to take a moment here to be real with you, because this video isn't a fluff piece. I'm not here to just give you the highlight reel. I'm here to give you the whole person. And the whole person of Michael Jackson is complicated. Deeply, genuinely complicated. Because alongside all the warmth and generosity and the stories of kindness, there were also the controversies. The things that genuinely troubled people, the questions that don't have clean answers. And we need to talk about them. The allegations that surfaced in 1993 shook the world. Jordan Chandler, a 13-year-old boy, and his father Evan Chandler made accusations against Michael Jackson. The allegations were serious claims of inappropriate contact. The media went into a frenzy, and overnight, the most famous musician on earth became the most scrutinized, most discussed, most debated person in the world. Michael consistently denied the allegations. He described his relationships with children as innocent, that he saw spending time with kids, letting them come to Neverland Ranch, sharing in their sense of wonder, as genuinely pure. He couldn't understand why the world couldn't see it that way. The case was investigated extensively. It went on for nearly a year, and ultimately, due to lack of evidence, and without Jordan Chandler testifying, the case was closed. Michael settled with the Chandler family outside of court for a reported $23 million, which his supporters argued was a business decision to make the legal nightmare go away, not an admission of guilt. His sister-in-law Toya had made damaging statements against him publicly, but later said she had been pressured by her then-husband to say those things and retracted them. And in 2003 and 2004, the allegations came again. Another trial, another year of global scrutiny, and at the end of it, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all 14 counts. Not we couldn't prove it, acquitted, by a jury that heard every piece of evidence. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to believe about Michael Jackson. These are complex situations, and reasonable people have looked at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. What I will say is this: the full story of Michael Jackson is not a simple story. He was not a simple person, and reducing him to either a monster or a saint does a disservice to the truth. What I can tell you is what the people closest to him, the ones who watched him every day, who saw how he interacted with children, who were there in the rooms, what they consistently said. And what they said was, Michael Jackson was a man who had never grown up, a man who was simultaneously the most famous person in the world and one of the loneliest, a man who found genuine solace in the company of children because they were the only ones who didn't want something from him. Whether that explains everything, answers every question, that's for you to decide. Let's talk about something that became one of the most discussed aspects of Michael Jackson's public image, the transformation of his appearance. Because if you look at photos of Michael Jackson from the early 1970s and compare them to photos from the late 1980s or 1990s, you're looking at two completely different faces. And the question everyone always asked was, why? The simple answer that the tabloids pushed was vanity, or self-hatred, or some desire to look white, or some kind of psychological disorder. The real answer is more complex, and frankly, more heartbreaking. It starts, as so many things in Michael's story do, with his father. Joseph Jackson's constant mockery of Michael's nose, calling it names, pointing it out, making it a source of shame, left a lasting mark. When Michael became successful and famous and suddenly had access to whatever he wanted, one of the things he wanted was to fix the thing his father had made him feel worst about. His first rhinoplasty, nose job, was in 1979 before Off the Wall. He claimed publicly that he had broken his nose during a rehearsal and needed surgery. That may have been partially true, but it was also the beginning of a much longer journey. And then came the Pepsi commercial incident. 1984, Michael is filming a Pepsi commercial. Pyrotechnics are involved, and during one of the takes, the fireworks ignite too early and Michael's hair catches fire. He suffered severe degree burns on his scalp. It was a genuinely traumatic and painful incident. And the treatment required to address those burns led to more procedures, more medical interventions on his face and scalp. And to manage the pain from those procedures and the surgeries that followed, Michael was introduced to prescription painkillers. That introduction would eventually become an addiction that would consume his life. Now here's the piece that most people don't know, or at least didn't understand at the time. The most dramatic change in Michael Jackson's appearance wasn't the nose jobs or the chin work. It was the skin. And for years, people assumed it was a choice, that Michael Jackson had decided, for whatever reason, to lighten his skin, to bleach himself white. The reality is that Michael Jackson had vitiligo. Vitiligo is an autoimmune skin condition where your immune system attacks the cells that produce pigmentation. The result is patches of skin that lose their color, turning white or very light, while the rest of the skin maintains its original tone. It affects people of all races, but it's especially visible and especially dramatic in its appearance in people with darker skin tones. Michael had vitiligo across his entire body. His hands, his face, his torso, the depigmentation was spreading continuously throughout his adult life. And you know what he did to manage it? He did what many people with severe vitiligo do when the condition progresses past a certain point. He evened it out. Rather than having a face covered in unpredictable white patches, he worked with dermatologists to make his skin tone more uniform. His own dermatologist confirmed this publicly in a 1993 interview. The autopsy report after his death in 2009 confirmed it again. The white glove hiding the patches on his hand, the long sleeves, the hats, the face coverings, all of it was to conceal the vitiligo, not a fashion statement, a coping mechanism. And instead of compassion, the world responded with mockery and accusations of self-hatred. Michael Jackson was dealing with a medical condition, one that must have been frightening and disorienting and painful, and the public turned it into a punchline. There's a question I keep coming back to when I think about Michael Jackson's life. What is it actually like to be the most famous person in the world? Not famous like people recognize you on the street. Famous like you cannot go anywhere, cannot walk through a mall, cannot sit in a park, cannot go to a movie theater, cannot live any version of a normal human life because the moment you appear in public, 500 people surround you and the experience immediately becomes something overwhelming and chaotic. Michael Jackson described this feeling in several interviews. He talked about how he would sometimes disguise himself just to walk around freely, put on a mask and a hat and different clothes, just to experience the simple pleasure of going somewhere without being mobbed. He talked about how he would rent out entire amusement parks at night, after closing, just so he could ride rides, just to have a normal experience. He talked about how he could hear a child laugh in a park from a car window and feel a pang of something, envy maybe, or grief, for the childhood he never got to have. And then there was Neverland. Neverland Ranch was built in 1988. Michael spent $17 million on it, a 2,700-acre property in California that he turned into something that looked less like a home and more like a theme park. There was a zoo, a Ferris wheel, a movie theater, a train, a carousel, candy everywhere. And look, the way the media framed Neverland was almost always sinister. Why does a grown man have an amusement park in his backyard? The implication was always dark. But here's another way to look at it. Michael Jackson was a man who worked from age 6, who never had a birthday party that wasn't also a performance opportunity, who never had a summer vacation, never went on a school trip, never had a treehouse or a bike or a neighborhood to explore as a kid. And when he finally had the money and the freedom to build anything he wanted, what he built was a childhood. His childhood, the one he never got. The candy, the rides, the animals, the movie theater, these weren't signs of something wrong. They were the signs of someone desperately trying to recapture something that had been taken from them. Whether that recapturing went too far in some ways, whether the lines between his own needs and the well-being of the children he invited into his world got blurred, those are the questions the world argued about. But the impulse behind Neverland, the emotional root of it, makes complete sense when you understand who Michael Jackson actually was. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough when people talk about Michael Jackson. The music industry. Specifically, the enemies Michael Jackson made in it. By the mid-1990s, Michael Jackson owned something extraordinarily valuable, the Beatles' catalog. He'd purchased it in 1985 for $47.5 million, outbidding Paul McCartney himself. This was a collection of publishing rights that generated tens of millions of dollars every year. And Sony Music, one of the most powerful entities in the entertainment business, really wanted a piece of that. Michael had a complicated relationship with Sony. They were his record label, they distributed his music, they were, in a business sense, his partner. But Michael felt like they weren't promoting his 2001 album Invincible properly. He felt like he was being squeezed out, sidelined, and he said so publicly. In 2002, Michael Jackson stood outside Sony's offices in New York during a protest and called Sony's CEO, Tommy Mottola, a devil. He accused Mottola of being racist and of exploiting black artists. That's a bold move. That's a dangerous move. Because when you publicly accuse the head of one of the biggest record labels in the world of being a devil and a racist, you've made a very powerful enemy. And here's where things get murky. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, weeks before a massive comeback concert tour called This Is It was set to begin. The tour had already sold over 1 million tickets in the first hour of sales. It was projected to be one of the most successful concert tours in history. If Michael Jackson completed that tour and reclaimed his position at the top of the music world, he would have had the leverage and the resources to potentially renegotiate or restructure his Sony dealings. He never got the chance. Now, I'm not saying there was a conspiracy. I'm not telling you someone had Michael Jackson killed. What I am saying is that the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that went beyond just sad drug overdose story. Questions that Michael's own family asked loudly. Questions that still don't have fully satisfying answers. June 24, 2009. Michael Jackson is at his rented mansion in Los Angeles. The night before, he had been at rehearsals for This Is It at the Staples Center. By all accounts, the rehearsal had been extraordinary. People who were there said he looked incredible, moved like he was 25 again. The old magic was back. He came home around 12:30 a.m., had a meal, and then tried to sleep. He couldn't. Michael Jackson had suffered from severe insomnia for years. He described it as one of the most torturous aspects of his life. There were stretches, 5 days, sometimes more, where he simply could not fall asleep, could not get his body to shut down. To cope, he had been working with his personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, who had introduced him to a drug called propofol. Propofol is an anesthetic. It's used in operating rooms to knock patients out before surgery. It is not a sleeping aid. It is an extremely powerful drug that requires careful monitoring, specific equipment to measure blood oxygen levels, careful dosage management, immediate access to resuscitation equipment if something goes wrong. Dr. Murray had none of that equipment in the bedroom. But Michael had found that propofol, what he called his milk, because of its white color, was the only thing that could make him sleep. And so, night after night, in a mansion bedroom, he was being administered a surgical anesthetic without the medical safeguards that would be required in any legitimate clinical setting. On the night of June 24th, Dr. Murray gave Michael a series of medications, anti-anxiety drugs, sedatives, trying to help him sleep. None of them worked. Michael's tolerance was so high, his body so accustomed to these substances, that normal doses had essentially no effect. At around 10:40 a.m. on June 25th, after Michael had been awake for nearly 24 hours, Dr. Murray administered propofol. Michael fell asleep, and he didn't wake up. Dr. Murray noticed something was wrong. Michael's breathing had become irregular. His pulse was weak. Murray attempted CPR on the bed, which reduces its effectiveness significantly. He administered other drugs to try to reverse the propofol's effects. And then, critically, he waited nearly 2 hours before calling 911. When paramedics arrived, Michael Jackson was already in full cardiac arrest. He was rushed to UCLA Medical Center. Doctors worked on him for over an hour. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. The news hit the world like a shockwave. Within hours, the internet slowed to a crawl. Google's servers struggled to handle the search volume. Twitter crashed. News websites were inaccessible for hours. When Michael Jackson's memorial service was broadcast on television, over 31 million Americans watched it, making it the most-watched non-sporting television broadcast in American history. Dr. Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, serving just under 2 years before his early release. The autopsy confirmed what Michael's doctors had suspected. His stomach contained only drugs, no food. He had not eaten properly in months. His body weight was dangerously low, essentially just skin over bones. His entire body bore the marks of countless injections. The drugs that would have killed an average person had become his daily reality, barely registering at normal doses. Michael Jackson had been slowly disappearing for years before he actually died. So here's the question I've been sitting with while putting this video together. Who was Michael Jackson? Was he the king of pop, the greatest entertainer who ever lived. The man who made Thriller, who invented the moonwalk, who sold 350 million records, who had 39 Guinness World Records, who was still the highest-earning deceased celebrity for years after his death. Was he the lost little boy from Gary, Indiana? The one who never got to have a childhood, who built an amusement park as an adult because no one let him have one as a kid, who sat with lost little girls in stadiums because he understood what it felt like to be scared and alone? Was he the troubled man, the one whose personal life raised serious, uncomfortable questions that the world is still arguing about? Was he the victim of an abusive father, of an industry that chewed him up, of a media that found his struggles more entertaining than his music? The answer, of course, is that he was all of these things. Because that's what human beings are. We are not one thing. We are not a headline or a verdict or a Wikipedia summary. We are the whole complicated, contradictory, messy truth of every moment we ever lived. Michael Jackson achieved things that no one before him had achieved and that no one since has come close to replicating. He changed music, changed dance, changed the very concept of what a pop star could be. He also suffered in ways that most of us will never understand. A childhood that wasn't a childhood, a fame so enormous it became a kind of prison, a body that was in constant pain, a mind that couldn't rest, a heart that, by all accounts, genuinely loved the world and couldn't understand why the world seemed so determined to misunderstand him. And I keep coming back to that little girl. In a stadium of 72,000 people, with the whole world watching, with an enormous production running on a tight schedule, Michael Jackson stopped. Because one child was scared. Nobody asked him to do that. There was no camera pointed at him in that moment, no PR reason to make the gesture. He didn't announce it to the crowd. He didn't take a bow. He just stopped everything, found her, made sure she was okay. And then went back to work. That's the Michael Jackson that a lot of people don't know. The one who sent financial support anonymously to families who wrote to him about struggles. The one who visited children's hospitals and sat with sick kids not for photos, but because he genuinely wanted to be there. The one who, even at his most famous, his most exhausted, his most scrutinized, never lost some essential part of himself that simply cared about people who were smaller and more vulnerable than him. Maybe that came from the little boy in Gary, who was never protected the way he should have been. Maybe it came from all those years of performing, while other kids got to just be kids. Maybe it came from some deep part of him that understood, instinctively, what it meant to feel small and frightened, and alone in a world that felt too big. Whatever the reason, it was real, and it was him. Michael Jackson's life is a story about the price of greatness, about what happens when talent is extraordinary, but the support systems around that talent are broken, about what fame does to a human being when it arrives too early and too intensely and never lets up. It's a story about a father who pushed too hard, about an industry that took too much, about a media that fed on the spectacle without asking about the person at the center of it. But it's also a story about music that moved people, about performances that made millions feel something they'd never felt before, about a man who, in his best moments, represented something genuinely beautiful, the idea that art can connect us, that creativity can transcend every boundary we put between ourselves. The world is still arguing about Michael Jackson, probably will be for a long time. But in between all the arguments, there's a little girl who was lost in a stadium of 72,000 people, and there's a man who stopped everything to find her. Remember that part too. All right, that's Michael Jackson, the full picture, as honestly as I could put it together. Look, this took serious time to research and write, and I hope you felt that in the way it came together. If you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you watching the whole thing. That means a lot. If this video gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see Michael Jackson even a little bit, drop a comment and tell me. I read every single one. Tell me which part hit you hardest. Tell me what you knew and what surprised you. Tell me if you think I got it right or if I got something wrong. This channel is a conversation and I want to hear from you. If you want more deep dive storytelling like this, because this is what we do here, we go deep on the stories that actually matter, then hit that subscribe button. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means every time we put something like this out, you'll actually see it instead of hopping the algorithm decides to show it to you. And share this one. Send it to someone who thinks they already know the Michael Jackson story. I think it'll surprise them. All right, I'll see you in the next one.